Hey everybody, what's up from Pokemon Classics, reminding you that the classics never go out of style. Today's video, we're covering a side of Pokemon investing that often doesn't get talked about, and when it does, it's often presented in a negative light of buying and selling regrets or mistakes. You see, it's often in our psychology to look back on purchases and sales decisions and evaluate them through the lens of hindsight, which can be a really dangerous undertaking. So that's what we're doing in this video today, looking back at 10 cards that I sold for far below their all-time highs and sharing some of my perspectives on these sales. Make sure you stick around to the end of the video for the final numbers because it's pretty shocking. Before we begin though, let me just say this, that collecting is a journey, and while it can be disheartening to look back on missed opportunities, I don't regret any of these earlier sales experiences. But we'll get into that more at the end of the video. Anyway, let's roll into the first sale. The first card on this list is a first edition Blaine's Charizard in PSA 9 condition. Now back during the boom in 2020, this card topped out at $1,611 in PSA 9 condition. That's a pretty hefty price tag for a PSA 9 version of the King of Beasts when it comes to Pokemon. Anyway, if we rewind the clock a little bit back to 2013, maybe 2014, I was actually working on completing the first edition Gym Challenge set in PSA 10 condition. And a bit earlier than that, I had actually achieved the PSA 10 copy of the Charizard and looking to recoup some of the investment that I had made into buying collections. So I sold my extra PSA 9 copy of this card along with an entire complete first edition Gym Challenge set, including all of the holos, in near mint or mint condition for $300. Now, that's a really low price tag by today's standards, but at the time, that was right in line with the market, and that extra money helped me fund some of those other collection purchases. Still, tough pill to swallow looking back at what could have been an extra $1,311. At number 2 on this list is a first edition Shining Mewtwo in PSA 10 condition. Now, I'm going to sound like a broken record throughout this video, because all of these cards that are on this list were actually duplicates for me, extras, that I sold to help fund future collection purchases. However, at the time, I was actually working on the Shining set and had acquired doubles of almost every one of the first edition Shining cards in PSA 10 condition. The Mewtwo one is pretty tough to look back on though. At its peak, Shining Mewtwo in first edition PSA 10 was selling for $6,500. And when you compare that to my sold price way back prior to 2016, and what I would guess was probably about 2015, I sold this card for $500, leaving about $6,000 of potential profit on the table were I to have held this card and optimized it selling at the absolute peak of the Pokemon boom. But again, things don't always work out that way, and that extra money was very helpful in purchasing some additional collections that also helped advance my collecting. So not too sad about it, but again, it's tough to look back on. Card number 3 on this list is taking us back to Gym Challenge with first edition Giovanni's Persian in PSA 10 condition. Now this card is notoriously difficult to grade in a PSA 10, and it's holding back a lot of completionists out there from finishing up their Gym Challenge sets in PSA 10. However, I was one of those people as I was working on my own PSA 10 set and fortunately found one at a reasonable price on eBay from a fellow collector and seller and purchased that card, adding it to my collection. Of course, maybe a few months, maybe a year at the most after, I actually graded one of these in PSA 10 and then had 2 copies available. So naturally, I did what a lot of collectors would do and sell that extra copy and use those additional funds to further advance with the cards that I still needed. Now looking at the all-time record sale price of this card back in 2020, it was going for $7,600 at its peak, and that is significantly more than my sale price, which I believe was also a record high for its time, of $400. Again, a little bit shocking to look back on $7,200 of a difference, but that's perhaps one of the testaments to how significantly cards can change in price, how much more demand can be added to the market, and how population plays a role in which cards are going to be investment worthy in the future. Still, pretty interesting data point. The next card on this list, coming in at number 4, is another Shining card from Neo Destiny. This time, it's first edition Shining Tyranitar in PSA 10 condition. Now, out of all the Shining Pokemon, this is by far my favorite one, and Neo Destiny is my favorite set of all time. So I really only have positive things to say about this card and its artwork. However, one thing I do have to mention is the extreme volatility in sales that this card has seen over the last few years. In fact, its all-time high coming back in 2020 was for $12,000, which is significantly higher than its overall average. I don't know if this was a statistical anomaly or if this was a sale that was never fully transacted and paid for, but that is the all-time high that's on this graph. Now, this is kind of shocking when I look back to my own sale all those years ago. This sale was actually made to the same buyer that bought the Shining Mewtwo previously mentioned, and so this one I also sold for $500 as an extra for my collection to help fund those future collection purchases. So looking back, seeing that $11,500 difference in my sale versus the all-time high, a little bit shocking, but it's something I don't have too much regret for. That again is just part of the experience when you're a long-term collector. Number 5 on this list takes us to first edition base set with the Zapdos in PSA 10 condition. Now, out of all the cards on this list, this is actually the only one that I didn't have a duplicate of in the same condition. I'd actually achieved a PSA 9 complete set of all of the holos from base set earlier in my collecting, and so the Zapdos, when I graded it in a PSA 10, had me really conflicted of whether I add that 10 to my collection then sell the 9 and have mismatched grades, or if I keep the consistency in PSA 9s and sell the 10. Ultimately, I caved in one of my lapses in judgment and sold the 10 and kept the 9 set all intact. Now, at its all-time peak back in 2020, first edition Zapdos in PSA 10 sold for $12,199. Oddly specific number if you ask me. However, my sale came much earlier than that, probably in about 2013 would be my guess, for about $500. Pretty substantial difference there. We're looking at about $11,700 left on the table. Anyway, Zapdos, card that I love, is actually the first holo that I ever pulled from a booster pack, was a base set Zapdos. Not a first edition, but Zapdos will always have a special place in my heart. Card number 6 on this video might be my favorite Pokemon artwork illustration of all time. It's the original Umbreon, the first edition Umbreon from Neo Discovery in PSA 10 condition. Now, I'll be the first to admit that I've been incredibly fortunate in my Pokemon collecting journey, where I could buy out collections early on before the boom when they were still readily accessible on eBay. Having said that, at one point I've held 3 different copies of this card in PSA 10 condition, and so this sale was for one of the extras. And at its all-time peak, this card sold in 2021 for $12,600. 5-figure price, a very hefty price tag, but one that I think is understandable given how popular Umbreon is as a Pokemon, but also just how gorgeous this card is overall as an illustration. Now, my sale was for $600, which was still a really good sale for its time all those years ago. However, when you compare it to that $12,600, that's still leaving $12,000 of a difference. So it stings a little bit, but it does help take out some of that sting, knowing that I still have this card in my collection. The next card on this list is another Neo card, this time from Neo Revelation, and it's first edition Misdreavus in PSA 10 condition. Now, for any of you that are fans of Wizards of the Coast, or maybe you enjoy collecting PSA 10 low population cards, if that's you, you know how difficult Neo Revelation is to grade. It has some of the lowest population cards in the entire hobby, and Misdreavus is no exception. Now, I was fortunate enough that I graded multiple copies of this card early on in PSA 10, and this sale was for one of the extras. Now, at its all-time high, Misdreavus sold for 5 figures in 2021, going for $16,000. A really hefty price for a really lightweight ghost Pokemon, if you ask me. Now, my sale was also for a record price at the time, at least I think it was, and this was definitely before the Pokemon Go boom in 2016, where my sale was for $600. Looking back, it's a bit of a kick to the shin to see that difference of $15,400, but again, that's just the way it goes and part of the experience as a collector. The next card on this list is one with an interesting backstory, but it's a Shadowless Charizard in PSA 9 condition. Now, this card saw a tremendous run-up in value during the peak of the Pokemon boom in 2020, passing the $20,000 threshold and selling for an all-time high price of $21,500. Now, this pales in comparison to my sale price that I have listed of $135, but there's actually a little bit of backstory here. You see, when I bought this card, I bought it already graded for $135 from an eBay listing At the time, the card was going for about $400 to $500. It was an opportunity that seemed too good to be true, and so I was planning on it actually being a different card, maybe the unlimited variant, which sold for about that much. And that was actually what the seller had originally intended. The seller still sent me this card, but sent me a note asking if I'd be willing to return it and have my money refunded, along with an additional $150 for my trouble. Now, that's never been my goal, is to take advantage of people as a buyer or as a seller. And so what I did is I actually sent the card back, accepted the refund of my $135, and let the seller keep the other $150 that he had offered me. And instead, he sent me an extra, I think it was $10 to get Chipotle. I was like, for my trouble, if you could send me some money for Chipotle, that's good enough for me. And so it was one of those situations where I didn't want to take advantage of somebody. So this wasn't really a sale so much as a refund. Nevertheless, if I had held on to that card, it'd be worth substantially more than what I got for it. I do have a couple other copies of this card in my collection though, so ultimately, not that big of a deal. At number 9 on this list is another Charizard card, this time the iconic first edition base set Charizard in PSA 9 condition. Now, when I first started collecting graded cards back in 2011, this card was selling for about $400. And now, at its peak back in 2020, the record price of this card was $55,100. That's a pretty substantial difference in just a little over 10 years. Anyway, this is a card I was fortunate enough to own multiple copies of at various points in my collecting. I still have 2 copies of this card today, one with a thick stamp and one with a thin stamp. Anyway, early on in my collecting, I had another copy of this card, and I actually sold that one. And this was one of my first major eBay transactions, and I was incredibly nervous to send something of that high value through the mail system, and how to get insurance, it was all new to me. Anyway, the transaction was $700, and I believe I spent about $70 to run it through registered mail and to insure it, and I was a nervous wreck throughout the process. Having said that, the buyer safely received the card and was happy. I was happy as a seller, and that first transaction gave me some of the funding that I needed to really build out my collection early on. So it was a necessary sale, but one that I can look back on and just think, man, times have changed. Lastly, we'll wrap it up with another Neo card. This time, it's first edition Lugia from Neo Genesis in PSA 10 condition. Now, this card has a lot of popularity behind it, and I've heard it compared to the Charizard, but of the Neo generation, and I think that's an apt comparison. It has a beautiful artwork, it's a low population and very difficult to grade, and it's a pretty iconic Pokemon featured in Pokemon the Movie 2000, so it does have that recognition. And these are some of the factors that might have led to its explosive price in 2020, where a sale was confirmed at $129,000 on PWCC auctions. Now, that price did drop pretty substantially since then, but that was the all-time record. This is another card that I had the good fortune of grading 2 copies of in a PSA 10 relatively early in my collecting experience, so I could sell that extra copy and then further fund my collection. I actually sold that copy for $1,600, which was a really good price at that time. And although it's tough to look back on, it's a tough pill to swallow and see $129,000 versus $1,600. The truth is that $1,600 was really valuable in funding some of those other collection purchases and helping me build out my collection during those early days before cards became harder to find on the market and before the values really jumped up. So everything has to be taken in perspective. Anyway, guys, I'm sure this is what you came here for, is the final numbers. Did I get wrecked in the sale of these 10 cards? And I think that is a conclusion you could draw if you approach this with a really pessimistic attitude. But anyway, I sold all 10 of these cards when you add up the sales together for $5,835. And if you take the all-time record high that these cards were sold for, you get $274,110. Ouch. But here's the lesson. I think often people are too pessimistic and too negative as they apply hindsight to looking back on some of their past decisions, perhaps as collections or pieces that they should have bought but didn't at lower prices, or sales that they made that they wish they would have kept so that they could sell at a profit now. You can drive yourself crazy with that, and it's important to remember that collecting is a journey and that all of those individual decisions are happening in the context of the market at that time, not in some theoretical gain situation in the future that we couldn't possibly project. It's also important to note the importance of capital. For me, in all of these situations when I was buying and selling these cards, I was settling for prices that were really good in that market context, but also that money could be used to fund further future purchases and help expand upon and grow my collection. And I wouldn't have the collection that I have today if I hadn't sold some of those items to help fund that. It's also important to note that a lot of these sales, when we're talking all-time highs, are outliers, and it's not possible to optimize every single sale that you'll ever make, catching the peak of the market for every single card. That's what I projected here in this video, but that's a very unrealistic and unhealthy way to go about collecting. And if you do, all you're going to do is beat yourself up now, in the future, and indefinitely. So my response, my advice would be to enjoy the journey, enjoy collecting. You can still try to be strategic and use your collection to help fund furthering your collection, and that's always been my strategy. But if you're going to try to maximize and win at every single thing, well, you're probably not going to have a whole lot of fun. Anyway, guys, thanks for joining me for this video. It was fun looking back, and I think sometimes that's the best way to move forward, is remembering where we came from. Anyway, I'm Pokemon Classics, reminding you that the classics never go out of style. We'll see y'all with the next video. Till then, stay well and enjoy collecting. See you, everybody.